Oh, here's John Dryden again, the man regarded by his contemporaries as the most important literary figure of the age, an age that in literature is sometimes called, in fact, the Age of Dryden. He's also sometimes called the first poet laureate, although that title was apparently used for William Davenant before it was used for Dryden. He lost Dryden his position when he converted to Catholicism, but he remained a force in English letters for a long time, and Samuel Johnson called him the father of English literary criticism. This is Knowle at Sevenoaks in Kent, which was the home of the Sackville family, the Earls of Dorset, but has belonged to the National Trust since 1946. Much of this goes back to the 15th century when it was used as a residence by Thomas Bourchier, or Boucher as the English call him, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who left it to the Archdiocese. Henry VIII acquired it from his Archbishop Cranmer, and Elizabeth gave it to Thomas Sackville, the first Earl of Dorset, her treasurer, and the author of Gorboduc, usually called the first important English tragedy. In Charles II's day, it was the home of the 6th Earl of Dorset, who was a friend of Dryden's, who was an occasional visitor here. And while we see a little bit more of Knowle, we'll hear the air in chorus, "I come to sing great Zempoala's story, whose beauteous sight so charming bright outshines the lustre of glory," from Dryden's play, The Indian Queen, set to music by Henry Purcell, the greatest English composer of the age. We've been hearing some of his music already in the background, and we'll hear more about him in the future. John Eliot Gardner calls The Indian Queen a sort of semi-opera. From this vantage point, Knowle almost looks like a whole walled city.
I come to sing great Zempoala's story. I come to sing great Zempoala's story.
This is the Wicket Gate, the main entrance.
Outshines the lustre of glory, whose beauty sight so charming bright outshines the lustre of glory. Come to sing great Zempoala's story. Come to sing great Zempoala's story.
The Bourchier Tower. And the Great Hall here now. Dryden was once the judge in a poetry writing contest held by the 6th Earl, who fancied himself, like his ancestor, the author of Gorboduc, something of a writer. In fact, he won his own contest with this poem submitted to Dryden, and I quote, "If I win this contest, I will pay Dryden £500 on demand." That sounded like pure poetry to Judge Dryden, and so the contest was no contest. Despite the fact that he's usually considered a tragedian, he did write some comedies and many a witty line. He characterizes Restoration England, well, when he says, "It was a very merry, laughing, quaffing, dancing, drinking, and unthinking time." He says, "Happy the man and happy he alone, who can call today his own, who secure within himself can say, tomorrow do thy worst, for I have lived today." That could be the motto of the Restoration, I think. His epitaph for his wife is also well known. It runs, "Here lies my wife, now let her lie, for she's at peace, and so am I." We'll hear now the duo and chorus from Purcell and Dryden's Indian Queen. "We the spirits of the air, that of human things take care," and we'll see a little more of Knowle while we do this. The staircase with the 3rd Earl's famous mistress, Janetta Bocelli, in marble down there. The Brown Gallery. The Venetian bedroom, so called because the ambassador from Venice once slept here. And a cartoon gallery named after the copies on the left of the cartoons by Raphael for a series of tapestries now in the Vatican Museum. One of the salutary things we can give Charles II credit for is the opening up of the great parks of London, formerly for royal use only, essentially to the public. Thanks to their preservation, one can still walk pretty much across London on grass. These parks soon became popular for what would now be called cruising, I suppose. Young blades in their handsome and handsomer carriages looking for pretty girls. This is Hyde Park, as it looks today, of course. John Evelyn, the contemporary diarist I quoted on the return of Charles, was a sort of proto-environmentalist and complained a lot about the smoke and crowds of the city, which these parks did something to alleviate. The long-lived Evelyn's diary covers over 60 years, from 1641 to 1706, in about 700 pages in my edition. He wrote about 30 other books as well on all sorts of subjects: printmaking, forestry, biography, but the diary is his most valuable contribution. This is a portrait of him by Kneller. During the Civil War, he traveled on the continent a good deal, and his accounts of visits to Paris, Rome, Venice, and so on make for very entertaining reading. He stayed in some memorable hotels. I'll just give you a little bit of an account of some of his experiences in these. These happen to be hotels in northern Italy. Of one he says, "In this wretched place I lay on a bed stuffed with leaves, which made such a crackling, and did so prick my skin through it, that I could not sleep." Of another one he says, "After supping here on cheese and milk with wretched wine, we went to bed in cupboards so high from the floor that we climbed them by ladder, and were then covered with feathers, and all little enough to keep one warm." And of a third, and keep in mind he was a wealthy man and could afford about the best there was available. He says, "Being extremely weary and complaining of my head, and finding little accommodation in the house, I caused one of our hostess's daughters to be removed out of her bed, and went immediately into it while it was yet warm, being so heavy with pain and drowsiness that I would not stay to have the sheets changed. But I shortly after paid dearly for my impatience, falling sick of the smallpox that she'd had." The fact that people would put up with accommodations like this says something about human curiosity, the desire to see the wonders of Italy, the wonders of the world. Well, the Restoration got off to a happy start, but in 1665 the plague broke out, which would have been an even more serious event had another calamity not cut it short by destroying the better part of the city. On September 2nd, 1666, a fire broke out in a bakery which was in what was then called Pudding Lane near London Bridge. And in that neighborhood, near where the fire did break out, after it was extinguished and London in the process of rebuilding, Christopher Wren was commissioned to erect a monument to commemorate the fire. This monument is still called simply The Monument, and it is said to be the highest freestanding column in the world now at 202 feet. The fire raged for 4 days and burned some 2/3 of London, including St. Paul's and 87 parish churches, and enough other buildings to leave some 200,000 people homeless, but amazingly very few lives seem to have been lost. I think it must be impossible to be accurate about this, but the numbers given are usually under a dozen. Evelyn and Pepys were both eyewitnesses, but both their houses survived. Pepys is barely so in Seething Lane, just northwest of the tower. Charles and his brother James, the Duke of York, are given a lot of credit by their contemporaries for helping as much as they could to stop the fire, even to manning bucket brigades and shoveling dirt. This is an anonymous picture of the fire now in progress. And I'll read part of Samuel Pepys' account. Remember, he was an eyewitness, and his house was just back behind the Tower of London there. He says, "Met my Lord Mayor in Cannon Street, like a man spent, with a handkerchief about his neck. He cried, like a fainting woman, 'Lord, what can I do? I'm spent. People won't obey me. I've been pulling down houses, but the fire overtakes us faster than we can do it.' So he left me, and I him, and seeing people all almost distracted and no manner or means of quenching the fire, I went to a little alehouse on the bankside over against the Three Cranes, and there stayed till it was dark almost, and saw the fire grow, and as it grew darker it appeared more and more, and in corners and upon steeples and between churches and houses, as far as we could see, up the hill in a most horrid, malicious, bloody flame, not like the fine flame of an ordinary fire." This map made after the fire gives an idea of the extent of the destruction. Most of the damage was done to the west of London Bridge because of the strong east wind that pushed the fire in that direction all the way to Temple Bar. The large shaded figure to the sort of left of center there is St. Paul's, or what was St. Paul's, and the smaller little shaded areas are the other churches which were destroyed. And then the following year, just as Londoners were rebuilding, and this was accomplished in an amazingly short time in an age without building permits, another disaster took place, in a sense maybe more of a psychological than material sort. One would think that the Dutch and the English would have gotten along well in Cromwell's day, the only two Protestant republics in the world, but what's the most important thing? Religion, politics, or money? They were also the two biggest commercial powers, and their interests conflicted and continued to do so after the Restoration. In 1626, the Dutch had established New Amsterdam, and in 1664, an English fleet took it and renamed it New York in honor of the king's brother James, the Duke of York. In 1666, then, the Dutch Admiral de Ruyter defeated the English in the 4 Days' Battle, and then in 1667, he brazenly sailed up the Medway south of the Thames to Chatham, where the English fleet was berthed, wrecked much of it, and towed away the flagship, the Royal Charles itself. This is a portrait by Kneller of Samuel Pepys, the famous diarist who was clerk of the Acts of the Navy at the time and had to try to explain how this could happen, how the fleet could be beaten to dust, as he put it in his diary, to Parliament. In the privacy of his diary, he in effect blamed the king for being off chasing moths with Lady Castlemaine when the disaster occurred. And Charles was at least partly to blame for ignoring the warning of the English spy Aphra Bane that the Dutch were in fact planning a raid on Chatham such as took place. This phase of the fighting with the Dutch ended with the English agreeing to give Suriname on the north coast of South America to Holland in exchange for New York. The Dutch thought they got much the best of the deal, and some think so still. This is the old Wine Shades Tavern, which claims to be the only tavern to have survived the fire, but since it's near St. Paul's, I don't see how that can be literally true. In any case, it says it was established here in 1663, so it's not unlikely Pepys spent some time in it. He began his diary on the return of Charles in 1660 and stopped writing it when he thought he was dying or at least going blind in 1669, but he didn't go blind and lived another 34 years. The first complete edition, the UC Press version, includes all previously expurgated passages. and it's only been in print a few years, but there are earlier versions that are essentially complete, and there are all sorts of abridgments available as well. Ernst Renan says that anyone who keeps a diary has no sense of the immensity of the universe, but the immensity of the universe is an argument against doing anything at all. I'll quote a passage here to give you an idea of the character of this, the most famous of all diaries, till Monica Lewinsky's anyway. Speaking of another tavern experience, he says, I went in with Mr. Thornberry, and there with his wife and two of his sisters and some gallant sparks that were there, we drank the king's health and nothing else, till one of the gentlemen fell down stark drunk and there lay, and I pretty well did the same. But no sooner abed was I than my head began to turn, and I to vomit, and if ever I was foxed, it was then, which I cannot say yet, because I fell asleep and slept till morning. Thus did the day end with joy everywhere. The next morning, he says, waked in the morning with my head in a sad state through last night's drink, which I am very sorry for. So rose and went out with Mr. Creed to drink our morning ale, which he did give me with chocolate in it to settle my stomach. You might try that next time you have a hangover. Here's another portrait of Pepys by a fellow named Klosterman. He was married at 27 to a 17-year-old penniless French Huguenot refugee who is the subject of many of the diary's most memorable passages. Here's an example. He says, being at supper, my wife did say something that caused me to oppose her in. She used the word devil, which vexed me. And among other things, I said I would not have her use that word, and she took me up most scornfully, which I know nowadays not how to check, so that I fear that without great discretion I shall go near to lose my command over her, giving her this occasion of dancing and other pleasures, whereby her mind is taken up from her business, and she finds other sweets besides the pleasing of me. In another entry he says, to Westminster Abbey and heard a fine sermon, but spent, God forgive me, most of my time looking at Lady Castlemaine. On November 13th, 1660, Major Harrison, who had signed Charles I's death warrant, was hanged, and Pepys was an eyewitness and reported his experience like this. Went to Charing Cross to see Major Harrison hanged, drawn, and quartered, which was done, he looking about as cheerful as any man could in that condition. Montaigne says that no man is so good that if he were to submit all his thoughts to the law, he wouldn't deserve hanging 10 times. Pepys submits all his thoughts to the reader, at least, but I don't think he deserves to be hanged. Maybe just slapped now and then. This is the monument that marks the site of his house, the house in which he was living at the time of the fire near the tower. Pepys could be so candid in his diary because he wrote in a code that wasn't deciphered until 1825, when he was safe from the vengeance of his political enemies, his wife, and assorted husbands. Later in his life, he lived in the White Building on the right here at number 12 Buckingham Street near Charing Cross. It was after he gave up writing the diary that his career reached its high point, and he is sometimes still called the Nestor of the Navy for his work as Secretary of the Admiralty. Charles founded the Royal Society in 1662, and Pepys became its president in 1684, and was in fact president when Isaac Newton, the Society's most famous member, published his Principia Mathematica. This is interesting because Pepys admits he, the president of the Society, didn't even know his multiplication tables well. The chemist Robert Boyle was also a charter member. John Evelyn was the secretary, and Christopher Wren wrote the preamble to the charter and gave the first address to the members. Why was Pepys the president? I suppose for something like the same reason he rose so high in the Admiralty without ever having been a ship captain even. He was a hard-working administrator who could get things done. This is a portrait of Sir Christopher Wren now by a fellow named Pearce in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford, Wren's alma mater. Christopher Wren is certainly one of the most universal geniuses in English history. He was a professor of astronomy at Oxford at 29. He lived to have 55 inventions credited to him by the Royal Society, of which he also served as president before Pepys. He illustrated a book on the anatomy of the brain. He was credited by Newton with experiments that helped lead the latter to the laws of motion, and he's usually regarded as the most important English architect. He was raised in Windsor, and there's an interesting building there by him, the Guildhall, which you see now. It's not an especially important building in his career, but the story goes that the citizens were concerned that the floor, supported as it originally was only around the perimeter, wasn't safe. Wren was asked to put columns under it, which he did. But as you can see in this picture, the columns are an inch or two short of the floor. It's as though Wren were saying, I'll put the columns there if you want them, but I'm an engineer, a mathematician, a scientist, and a friend of Isaac Newton's, and I'll show you in posterity for the next 300 years that they aren't necessary, and the floor still hasn't settled enough to reach them. In 1662, when he was 30, Wren was commissioned to build a Sheldonian theatre at Oxford. In the early 17th century, Inigo Jones had been the first important English architect to wholeheartedly adopt the classical style, but so little that he built survives. The Whitehall Banqueting House we saw last quarter is the most important example. That Wren is really the fellow who put the classical stamp on English building that has lasted for pretty much the rest of its history. The Clarendon building on the right was, incidentally, built by his most famous pupil, Nicholas Hawksmoor, and is even more obviously classical than Wren's theatre from this angle. The theatre is said to have been inspired by the Theatre of Marcellus in Rome, which Wren hadn't seen except in engravings, but however much it may resemble that antiquity, it is wholly Italian and classical in its exterior decoration, except for the cupola. The interior is not as obviously reminiscent of anything Roman or Renaissance, nor does it really have the atmosphere of the Baroque about it. Wren is a little hard to classify using the traditional terms. Some of his buildings, even occasionally St. Paul's, are called Renaissance, but to call things Renaissance that weren't finished until the 18th century is to risk really puzzling people. It's best just to think of them as classical, I guess. Before the fire, Wren had already been working on plans to remodel St. Paul's, and after the fire, he presented Charles with an ambitious plan to remake pretty much the whole city of London with wider streets and open squares and so on. Charles approved the plan, but it proved impossible to put into effect. Nevertheless, over about the next half century, he rebuilt a total of over 50 churches, including St. Paul's. St. Mary Le Bow, you see here now, is one of about 25 which still stand. Many were damaged beyond repair in the World War II bombing of the city. The steeple, a sort of Gothic survival with classical decorations, is really the hallmark of Wren's churches. Here you see the steeple of St. Vedas now, and we're going to see several more of Wren's surviving churches, all within a short walk of St. Paul's, and we'll hear part of another work by Purcell, part of another suite for another play by John Dryden, King Arthur. This is St. Edmund the King on Lombard Street. St. Bride's. Pepys was baptized here in the pre-fire church. This is the interior of St. Bride's. St. Margaret Lothbury. St. Michael Paternoster Royal. St. Lawrence Jewelry. St. Mary Magnus. St. Stephen Walbrook was almost completely destroyed in World War II, but it has always been admired as one of the finest of Rennes churches, so special effort was made to rebuild it. It's the dome here rather than the steeple that stands out. This is the interior. As I said, it's odd to call St. Paul's a Renaissance church, and in fact the term Renaissance is not applied to very many English churches at all. Even in dealing with secular architecture, the term is not as common as ones like Tudor or Elizabethan or Jacobean. One could argue that the style of English church building goes straight from Gothic to Baroque. I'll talk about this point more when we see St. Paul's. Rennes' influence lasted a long time. This is the steeple of St. Clement Danes, built by James Gibbs in the early 18th century. And this is the well-known church of St. Martin in the Fields, also by James Gibbs, which always strikes me as the ultimate example of classicism combined with the steeple. This is what the Parthenon would look like with a steeple on it. It was ridiculed by many of his contemporaries, especially the French, but like a lot of buildings considered utter folly when they were new, it's come to be a beloved part of the London cityscape. It was the parish church of Whitehall, and Charles II was baptized in the previous church on the spot, and Nell Gwyn was buried in the cemetery that was where Duncannon Street is now to the right of the church. That's the London National Gallery on the left on Trafalgar Square, and we have seen and still will see a lot of things in there, of course. In 1682, Charles commissioned Rennes to build the Chelsea Royal Hospital, which you can see in this picture. Tradition says that good-hearted Nell Gwyn was behind this, but John Evelyn pushed the idea also. Louis XIV had just built the Hôtel des Invalides in Paris for a similar purpose, and that might also have been part of the king's motivation. It was not so much a hospital as a home for disabled veterans like Les Invalides, and unlike the latter, it still functions in that capacity with about 400 pensioners in residence. Later, William and Mary had Rennes build the much more impressive Naval Hospital at Greenwich, which you see here. At the back is also the Queen's House, another rare surviving building by Inigo Jones for Anne, the wife of James I. It is said that Rennes was required to build this place so that the view of the Thames from the house wouldn't be blocked, so one gets sort of the impression that what might have been one building has been cut in half and the two parts separated. Kenneth Clark calls this the finest architectural ensemble built in England since the Middle Ages. The paired columns one sees used here were probably picked up by Wren on his visit to Paris, the idea for them in 1665 when he had the chance to meet Bernini and also look over various plans for Louis XIV's additions to the Louvre. The east front of the Louvre is usually said to display the first use of this motif in Europe, though Michelangelo used it on the Drum of St. Peter's in Rome. They also show up on several other important French buildings of the day like Versailles and the Church of Les Invalides. Here's the great dining room of the former indigent sailors' home. Kenneth Clark calls this one of the finest rooms in England and says that this is what civilization is all about. He says, and this is a quote, "Civilization is a state of mind where it's thought desirable for a naval hospital to look like this and for the inmates to dine in a splendidly decorated hall." This complex, like most of Wren's churches, is something that can be called Baroque. Pevsner, in his Dictionary of Architecture, calls this kind of thing in England Baroque classicism. Here's a portrait of Wren by Klosterman, and in the background you can see the church that's usually regarded as his masterpiece, St. Paul's. As I mentioned earlier, he had already been working on plans to remodel the old church before the fire, so he was obviously the man with the inside track to rebuild it after it was so badly burned as to be beyond remodeling. The work didn't always go smoothly, and money was a constant problem. Indeed, where the money to do all this building came from is a bit of a mystery to me. The king was chronically in debt, the war with the Dutch was expensive, and the destruction of the city reduced tax income. At one point, Wren's salary was reduced by half, not so much, though, as a cost-cutting measure, but rather as a punishment for taking too long to build the church. Here's the facade of St. Paul's now. It did take a long time to complete. It was not declared officially finished until 1711. Apart from the steeples, which are very like the ones that dominate his smaller churches, but which seem just barely large enough here, the whole facade could pretty much have been taken straight from an ancient Roman temple. Will Durant calls it the finest church ever built by Protestants. German and Austrian architects of this age, no less than English and French ones, were much inspired by Italian precedents, but the English and French drew more on ancient Roman models and the classicism of Vitruvius, the contemporary of Julius Caesar, who wrote very influentially about how to build correctly, while the Germans and Austrians were more influenced by dramatic adaptations of classicism in the work of 17th century Roman architects like Borromini, who emphasized curvilinear motifs. Seen from this angle, it's important to point out not so much the classical influence, but the medieval influence that might not be so obvious at first glance. Wren essentially used the ground plan of Old St. Paul's, and as a result, the church has the long choir east of the crossing that one associates with the Gothic style in England of the Middle Ages, and the dome creates much the same effect as the crossing towers of the same period. Then, of course, the church is, as a whole, very long, too, over 500 feet. Very long in proportion to its height. It's only about 90 feet from floor to ceiling in the nave, in the manner of the English Gothic style also. Here's the nave now inside. You should hold this in your mind's eye until we see the great Baroque churches of Bavaria and Austria in a couple of weeks, because they're going to look very different. Places like Ottobeuren and Fritzingheiligen may have a sort of classical presence on the outside, but when you go inside, you're going to be in another world. St. Paul's is pretty much as classical inside as it is outside, and the effect is grand and solemn. Inside the Catholic churches, we'll see all is going to be light and color, stucco and plaster, and the most serpentine and curvilinear arrangements imaginable, with the whole fantastic vaults painted end to end. We'll be back to see St. Paul's in more detail after it's finished, by which time Handel will be in London to write some appropriate music. But while we're here now, this is Wren's tomb in the crypt with the memorable epitaph, Si monumentum requiris circum spice. If you're looking for his monument, look around you. Well, we'll see more of his work at Kensington and Hampton Court next week, hear about the Glorious Revolution and war with France, hear more about Louis XIV and Versailles, and then be back in England to see Blenheim Palace and Chatsworth, and hear also about the so-called Augustan Age in English literature.